guys, it's Eric, owner of Farpoint Farms here in the mountains of North Carolina. Today I'm going to be starting a whole new series of CB radio and ham radio related videos. These are going to be looking at some of the interesting parts of CB radio that you may not be aware of. And today we're going to start off with one of the more interesting ones out there that I get a lot of requests on this. And I've mentioned it briefly in some of the radios that I picked up, but I've never really gone over it. And that is freebanding or out-of-band use of CB radios. So this is illegal for North America use, obviously, but this is something that a lot of radios came equipped with or were modified to have on them back in the day. And so when you buy a used radio, if you see extra switches on that's pretty much what that means. So let me go ahead and go over it with you, and I'll explain why people were doing freebanding and why it's still around in some places, but really not very well used anymore, and for good reason, and we'll go over that. So to start with, freeband is this, and here's a picture of a chart. The regular 40 channels right here in the center, those are the CB channels. And so at some point or another, somebody realized, especially on some of these older radios, that you could go in here and modify a radio with a switch to change where the frequencies lied. So I could go maybe 40 up above the regular 40 channels and 40 down below the regular channels. And they called these export kits, or they called them Expo 1 or Expo A. There were a lot of these kits available. Usually it involved taking your radio, bringing it down to the radio shop, and have them install one of these kits. Some of them were butchered, like where you had drill holes and they just had these really crappy toggle switches in there. And other ones were really nice, where they would take a knob off of the standard radio and change that function, so to give it an ABC switch or whatnot. So there were some really cool setups to it. So that's what's basically happened there. So you had export radios that were capable of doing stuff. This RCI, for instance, is capable of transmitting 10, 11, and 12 meter. From the factory it's 10 and 12 because it's a ham radio, but you could flip a switch or add a chip to it or something and modify this for use on 11 meters. And the same thing in these Unidens here. Now they're a more modern radio. They're actually kind of designed not to be able to do that, although there are some folks who have made custom chips to make these things work out of frequency or out of band. But back in the day, like the Uniden Grant that I had, those were really easily modifiable. The Cobras and the Unidens and a lot of the base stations, most of the real cool base stations that you saw operating in the 90s had those switches. Here's why. Okay, so in the 80s, obviously in the 60s and 70s too, but in the 80s and 90s, the bands were crazy flooded with people. There were a lot of people talking. 40 channels seems like a lot today when there's only maybe one or two conversations going on throughout the band, but back then almost every station had something going on. And if it didn't and the solar cycle was high, and we'll get into what that means in a different video, but if the solar cycle was at a high point and we were getting lots of skip conditions, then it may be very difficult to communicate with someone just next door, because there's just so much background noise, so many conversations from so many different parts of the world kind of overlapping, creating a very unusable environment for most regular users. That's where freeband came into place. Now this ticks off a lot of ham users. It also ticked off the government, because some of the bands they were using were military aircraft bands or just military use bands. So we were trampling on ham radio bands and on government bands, which is not a good thing. But it didn't slow down or stop this from happening. And I do admit that back in the late 80s, I had a radio that had the switches. It was a Uniden Grant, and I was able to talk on the uppers. I didn't have access to lowers. So let's say this. It's Friday night. We have our net meeting, and it's 1995, and everyone's on channel, and they're talking on sideband, and skip starts rolling, and now we can't hear anybody. Or maybe there was some joker who was just messing up the radio, just cussing up a storm, doing something stupid. Back then you would say, hey man, why don't we go up 12 or whatever, and I'll see you there. And that meant, well, okay, yeah, I'm going to flip the switch and I'm going to move 12 channels up out of the band, and I'd have a conversation there. And now, generally speaking, those out-of-band conversations, those, the freebanders, that was a beautiful spot, because it would be quiet, there wasn't skip, unless it was static bleed over from somebody running a huge amp. Usually those would be quiet, so you could do a lot of long distance DXing, or you could have a private conversation from a good range, even during a peak in the solar cycle, by using those freeband or out of band channels. So that's pretty much it. As you can see from the chart here that I have posted here, there's Expo kits, and they'd have channel group A, B, C, D, or E. But most of the time, people were just adding the uppers and maybe the lowers. So you'd get your 1 through 40 and then 40 through 80. and then 1 through -40, and that's where most of it happened. And again, these channels would work on regular AM, but they'd also work on sideband as well. So it gave a whole new grouping of channels that people had available. Now, as time went on, the need for this kind of died off. Right around the the 2000s, the early 2000s, the peak of radio use really started to drop off, along with a lot of technologies because of the internet. And as that faded away, the need to be on those other upper bands or lower bands really kind of faded away with it, because the regular 40 just started to get quieter and quieter. And a time like this, where, as you can see, I've had that radio on scan since I came out here, there's no skip at all. We're in a solar minimum right now. There's very little skip going on, and there's hardly any traffic. Since no one local is talking this early in the morning, it's just me out here. So there would be no need for me to switch to an upper band or a lower band to get a private conversation going, when pretty much the whole band feels private right now. Anyway, that's it. That is a quick and to the point explanation of what freebanding or out of banding or uppers and lowers means, and I hope you enjoyed that. If for those of you who didn't know that, or for those of you who happen to come across a radio at a flea market or a yard sale or even online that has added switches, now you know what they do. And who knows, maybe someday when the solar maximum hits again and CB radio becomes super popular, there'll be a need for it again. But I certainly wouldn't go out and spend any money having your radio modified to do this, because it's kind of a lost art and a lost cause and a lost need. So if you enjoyed the video, I hope you will like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
There's always something that needs a little fixing on Far Point Farms. Freedom is mighty sweet. Liberty sows its seed at Far